Have a look in the Parashas Vayetze. We have the marriage of Yaakov to Rachel, to Leah, to Bilhah, to Zilpah, and then of course we've got the birth of the Shvatim, and that's what we're going to focus on. Even though we're telling the story of the birth of only one of them, the message that we're going to learn is going to be relevant to all of them. You won't see that immediately, but down the line, that's the objective of this particular sikha. So that puts us in Perek Choftes, Pasuk Lamed Beis, Perek chapter 29, Pasuk 32. It's in Shlishi, in the third segment of the parasha, and that's basically what we're going to learn about is the birth of the first one of the Shvatim. So if you go back one pasuk before, Pasuk Lamed Aleph, so it says, Vayar Hashem ki sinu'a Leah. Hashem saw that Leah was hated. It's a very strong word, but that's what the Torah says. Hashem saw that Leah was hated. Vayiftach es rachma, so he opened her womb, meaning to say he allowed her to have children. Whereas V'Rachel akara, in the meantime, Rachel remained barren while all of this was happening. We're going to focus on the next pasuk, Pasuk Lamed Beis, Pasuk 32. Vatar Leah vateled bein. Leah conceived and she gave birth to a son. Vatikra shemoy Reuven, and she called his name Reuven. Why did she call him Reuven? Ki amra, because she said, Ki ra'ah Hashem be'oni, Hashem has seen my suffering. Ki ata ye'ehovani ishi, because now that I've given birth to the first child, ye'ehovani ishi, my husband will love me. So the previous pasuk tells us that Hashem saw that Leah was hated. Now that she has this child, she's convinced that she will be loved, and therefore she calls him Reuven. Now what's interesting is when you have a look at Rashi has an interesting take, because the pasuk says, why does she call her son Reuven? Why? Because Hashem has seen my suffering. Let's see what Rashi says. Rashi says, Vatikra shmoi Reuven, Rabbi Say No pirshu. Our sages Chazal expounded on this pasuk, Amra, that Leah made a statement which was actually prophetic. So according to the pasuk, why is he called Reuven? Because of what's happening to her life now. Says Rashi, Rabbi Say No pirshu, the Rabbanan expounded on this pasuk that it's a prophetic statement, and what she was saying is, Re'u ma bein b'ni leven chami. She was actually saying, look at the difference between my son, Reuven, and the son of my father-in-law, Esav. Because what did Esav do? Shemochar ha-bechoira leYaakov. Because we see that Esav happily sold his rights to be the firstborn to his brother Yaakov over a bowl of lentil soup. So that indicates that he didn't really care much for the bechoira, for being the firstborn, and he kind of just gave it away. V'zeh lo mochra leYosef. Whereas my son Reuven, again this is prophetic, he is not going to sell his rights to be the firstborn to his brother Yosef. Yaakov will be the one who will give the birthright to Yosef, and that's why Yosef's sons become two tribes, two Shvatim, because the Bechor, the firstborn, gets double portion. So Yaakov takes away the opportunity for Reuven to be considered the firstborn, other than physically, but conceptually and spiritually, he loses that right. But not chas v'shalom that Reuven was willing to sell it. And not only that, v'lo irer olav, the fact that he loses the birthright to Yosef, Reuven doesn't make a big fuss about it. You never once find in the Chumash that he complains, why did you give my rights to my brother Yosef? Not only that, not only did he not complain, but later on, when the brothers throw Yosef into the pit, Reuven's plan, his intention was to rescue his brother. It didn't work out because he was busy with his process of doing teshuvah. According to one opinion, according to the other opinion, it was his day to go serve his father. And so while he was gone, they sold Yosef to slavery. But Reuven's intention had been to rescue his brother. So according to Rashi, what's Leah saying? Look at the difference. Look at Bain, my son, and how different he is from the son of my father-in-law, Esav. Two firstborns and two totally different attitudes towards being the firstborn. Now, when you read this, there has to be a glaring question that it's got to hit you square between the eyes, even without having to explore deeply and ask major questions on this Rashi. There's an incredibly obvious question. And that is, we know that Rashi's goal in his interpretation is to address anything in the pshat, in the simple understanding of the pasuk, that is not clear. Now, what's not clear in the pshat? Why in the pshat is he called Reuven? Tells us clearly. She says clearly. Why is he called Reuven? Ki ra'ah Hashem be'ani, because Hashem has seen my suffering. And now my husband is going to love me because I've given him a son. So why does Rashi have to explain this at all? Why even get into the conversation? There is nothing in the story, apparently, that we don't understand. We understand Reuven, ra'ah Hashem be'ani. Hashem has seen my suffering. So that's the first question. Why does Rashi Bichlal in the first place address this question? Question number 2, it would appear not only is Rashi tackling a question that, as far as we're concerned, doesn't exist. As far as we're concerned, the pasuk is straightforward and self-understood. So why would Rashi have to ask any questions and probe into in any commentary? But besides that, now that Rashi does actually do so, now that Rashi asks that question and he doesn't state a question, right? But Rashi goes straight into an alternative explanation. So we've got to ask ourselves, his explanation seems to contradict what the pshat of the pasuk says. The pshat of the pasuk is, why is this boy called Reuven? Because Hashem, Leah says, has seen my suffering. And according to Rashi, why is this boy called Reuven? Because Leah saw prophetically that there would be a major distinction between her son and Esav. Now, that's not the pshat, that's contrary to the pshat. The pshat says it was all about her personal experience as the less favored wife. And Rashi is making it all about his experience as a person, Reuven, something that's going to play out in the course of his life. So those are our 2 major questions that set us off. Shortly we'll come back and ask some other detailed questions. But the major questions are, why does Rashi have to address something that seems to be self-evident? So why explain it if it's already explained? And when you do explain it, why give an explanation that seems to go against what the Torah has already told us? Some of the Mefarshim want to suggest that what bothers Rashi is the name Reuven. Because Reu, where effectively it sounds like she's saying, see, look what's going on over here. That is addressed in the pasuk. Look how Hashem has seen my suffering and addressed it. But the word Bain, which is a son, is not addressed by the pshat of the pasuk. The pshat of the pasuk doesn't say anything about his status as her son. The pasuk only speaks about her status as a mother. Now that she's become a mother, her husband will love her. And according to the Mefarshim, that's what Rashi is concerned about. And so therefore Rashi wants to give an explanation that addresses the word Bain, the word son. So what addresses the word son? This interpretation, that there's something unique and special about this son, about Reuven, and that's what she was so happy about, and that's what she's praising Hashem for. Now the problem with that answer, or that explanation, which is given by the Mefarshim, is it's really a bit of a stretch, and maybe more than a stretch, because look at that word be'ani. Be'ani is base, ayin, nun, yud, yud. What's important for us is that inside the word be'ani is the word ben. The base and the nun are there. And it is quite possible that Reuven is an abbreviation of Reu be'ani. Look and see what happened to my suffering. And the word Bain is a contracted form of the word be'ani. So therefore, we don't have to come up with another explanation to satisfy the Bain part of the name, because we can argue that the Bain part of the name is an abbreviated form of the word be'ani. Now I know what you're thinking, says the Rebbe. And the Rebbe says, you know what you're thinking. You're going to think, hang on a second, but there are certain letters missing. There's no ayin in Reuven. There's no yud in Reuven. So it's a little bit of a stretch to say that just the two letters base nun represent the entire word be'onyi. Plus, be'onyi has a shva. The vowel under the base is a shva, be. In the word Reuvein, there's a tsere under the base, vein. Surely that's not the same word. Surely it's a real stretch to imagine that the Beis Nun could be an abbreviation for the word Be'onyi. So maybe Taka, Rashi has to give an alternative explanation because that's a little bit too far-fetched. Except that if you go back to Bereshis, right at the beginning of the Torah, one of the first interpretations Rashi ever gives on any verse in the Torah, it's on the word Shamayim. How does Rashi explain Shamayim? He gives three possibilities of what Shamayim could mean. It could mean So Mayim, in other words, it's a reality that carries water, contains water. Or it could mean Sham Mayim, that there's water there. So they're very similar concepts, even though the wording is slightly different. And he says it could mean Eish Umayim, that the reality of Shamayim is that it's a reality of the combination of fire and water, which I suppose would relate to the two angels, Michael, Gavriel, the Sar Shel Mayim, Sar Shel Eish, the master of water, the master of fire. Either way, Rashi was quite happy to say that Shamayim, just the shin, just one letter out of that word, could represent Sa, Sham, or Eish. And he was okay with that. And of course you could say, look at the difference. Shamayim and Sa, it's a different variation of the letter, a shin and a sin. And you definitely could say that the Nakuda voweling under the word shin, under the letter shin in the word Eish, is totally different to the voweling under the shin in the word Shamayim. And yet Rashi was quite okay with the fact that a word in Torah could be an abbreviated form of other words, even with different voweling, and that is acceptable. So seeing as we now have evidence that Rashi is okay with, he accepts the possibility of interpreting words in the Torah to be contracted versions of other words, even if the letters are missing, and even if the voweling is different. So then back to square one, in our case, Reuven could mean, the Beis Nun of Reuven could mean Be'onyi in an abbreviated form. So therefore, you could argue that the word Reuven, the name itself, speaks to the theme of seeing my suffering. So therefore, we're back to square one. Why does Rashi need to offer another explanation? We've got a great explanation. Look at the pasuk, the verse itself. It tells us how he got his name. What is his name all about? Her incredible declaration. Wow, look at this. Hashem has seen my suffering. Hashem appreciates what I'm going through and has therefore given me a child. So those are the major questions. Now let's look at a few specific questions. Rashi wants to tell us that Reuven is Leah's proclamation, declaration. Look at the difference between my son and Esav. Okay, so we get it. Let's assume for whatever reason it is, Rashi felt that the pasuk on its own is not telling us enough information and we need another explanation, possibly a different explanation. And that different explanation is going to be, look how different Reuven is to Esav. Still, if you want to compare Reuven to Esav, surely the logical way to do it is find information that is close and accessible, rather than to find information that is further down the historical line and a few parashas away. That's just logical. That's normally the way to do things. If you want to make a comparison, try and find information that is easy to access. So what does she say? Look at the difference between Esav, who sold his birthright. Okay, fine, that's last week's parasha. Last week's parasha. And let's compare that to the fact that Reuven does not hold a grudge against Yosef for losing the birthright to Yosef, something that we're only going to learn about in 2 parashas' time. That's a much easier thing to do. Look at Esav. He was a ganav. He was a thief. He was a robber. He was a highwayman. Compare that to Reuven. What's going to happen with Reuven in this week's parasha? Reuven is going to go get flowers for his mother. Dudoim, these jasmines or whatever flowers they were, that he was going to get for his mother. And the Torah makes a big deal that it was at a time where these were wild flowers that were growing, that he didn't, God forbid, trespass on anybody's property or take something that didn't belong to him. There's a great way to compare the two. Esav is an out-and-out ganav, and Reuven is careful not to take wild flowers for his mother unless he knows that they're absolutely ownerless. So why, if Rashi believes that Reuven means look at the difference between the two candidates, the two characters, why does he believe that it has to specifically be that Leah was drawing attention to their different attitudes to being the firstborn and not the difference between their character and their honesty and integrity? Next question. This comment that Rashi is giving us, this explanation, he says, Rabbi Say No Pirushu. So therefore, you know that it either has to come from a Medrash or from the Gemara. It turns out that it comes from the Gemara. So what's Rashi quoting? He's quoting a Gemara. You normally expect that when Rashi quotes, whoever he quotes or whichever source he quotes, he typically tries to keep as close to the original as possible. Okay? Now if you go back to the Gemara focuses very strongly on the different attitudes that these two people had to their respective brothers. So the Gemara makes it a big deal about how much hatred Esav developed for Yaakov after Yaakov got the birthright, even though he was the one who sold it to him. Still, the Gemara makes a big deal over the fact that he held a grudge against him, Vayistom Esav, that he held a grudge and then he made a plan of how he's going to kill his brother, as compared to Reuven, who held no grudge, as Rashi tells us. And not only that, he looked to help his brother Yosef, who had usurped his firstborn rights. He still looked to help him. So in the Gemara, the emphasis is on the different levels of hatred versus forgiveness. Esav hates, Reuven forgives. That's not the focus that Rashi focuses on. Rashi focuses on Esav was willing to sell his birthright, and Reuven did not want to sell his birthright. Why is that the focus? Surely what you're trying to tell me is the difference in character, and the character plays out in how they deal with things that didn't go their way. Why is Rashi making the focus over here whether or not they were willing to sell the birthright? Also, another last question that we have on Rashi, if you look at how Rashi does it, Rashi says, Reuven did not want to sell the birthright. Not only that, but he even didn't make an issue or complain afterwards that Yosef got the birthright. Not only that, but when Yosef was in trouble, he intended to save Yosef more than the other brothers, which indicates not only did he not hold a grudge, but he was completely forgiving of his brother. Now, if you're making a comparison between two people, don't you think Rashi should have said, contrast that with Esav? Not only did he willingly sell the birthright, Rashi tells us that part, but then Rashi should have said, not only that, he held a grudge against his brother. Rashi doesn't say that. Not only that, he wanted to kill his brother. Rashi doesn't say that. So how come if Rashi is making a contrast between two personalities, does he not make a full contrast? He just kind of picks out one point, whether or not Esav was willing to sell the birthright, compares that to Reuven, and then he goes on building up how great the character of Reuven is. So these are the questions that we have to address. Of course, the biggest question of the lot is why Rashi has to comment on this pasuk at all. And it appears that his commentary takes us away from the pshat, when the pshat is clear. He's called Reuven because she feels that Hashem has felt her pain and commiserated with her and given her the comfort of a son. So all of this is going to hinge on one phrase in the pasuk that actually is the one we really have to think about. What does she say? Ki ra'a Hashem ba'ani, Hashem has seen my suffering, and then she says, Ki ato ye'ehovani ishi, now my husband will love me. Let's think about this for a second. Let's assume that this was not written in the Torah, Let's assume that we had no pasuk speaking about the nature of what it means to become a mother, what it means to the husband. Let's put that all out of the picture for a minute and just ask about human nature. Is it not correct to say that in human nature, the way of people is that a man who loves his wife, when that wife becomes a mother of his child, his love and admiration for her will naturally deepen? I think everybody would agree with that. That's the way of the world. He gets to have a whole new admiration, a whole new respect, and a whole new love, because this is now the person who helped me to be able to establish a family. This is the mother of my child. It's a completely different experience of love and admiration. So do I need a pasuk to tell me, Ki ato ye'ehovani ishi, now my husband will love me? Like it's a huge surprise. Hello, look at this. Something unbelievable is going to happen here. It doesn't happen to ordinary people, but me, Hashem has given me a special bracha. Ra Hashem be'ani, Hashem has seen my suffering, and therefore he's given me a special bracha that my husband will love me. It seems a little overplayed. Except, of course, when you look at it in context, because once you look at it in context, you'll appreciate that for Leah, it wasn't naturally guaranteed that her husband would love her for having the first child. Why? Previous pasuk Lamed Aleph says, Vayar Hashem kisnu'a Leah. Hashem saw that Leah was despised. So that's her reality. In other words, her relationship with Yaakov is not the classic relationship of husband and wife. And it makes sense. He did not plan to marry her. That wasn't his intention. She was not the person he had worked 7 years in order to marry. He had said, Vayehav Yaakov es Rachel. Rachel was the woman he loved, but he was a decent human being, and therefore the fact that this debacle occurred with Leah, he understood that it, firstly, out of respect to her, secondly, out of respect to Rachel, who had supported her in that, and thirdly, and probably most importantly, the fact that he understood that this is all divine providence and this is who he's supposed to marry. But you cannot tell a person how to feel. You can tell a person what to do. You can tell a person this is the appropriate behavior. For whatever reason it is, you have to be married to Leah. For whatever reason it is, she's the one, and he didn't necessarily know it at that time, who will bear the majority, the lion's share of the 12 tribes of Israel. But that doesn't, you can't necessarily feel the love, so it's not natural. It's not a natural relationship, and he doesn't naturally love her. And therefore, it's not a guarantee that because she bears his first child, he will dafka now start to love her. It's not a guarantee. In fact, we all know how the story is going to go. Even Leah knew it at the time. Nobody knew when it was going to happen, but everybody knows that Rachel was going to have children as well. And when Rachel would have those children, whatever love Yaakov would have had for Rachel then will increase in the natural way that a man loves his wife more when she becomes the mother of his child. So whatever Leah would experience, whatever love and admiration Yaakov might have for her, there's no guarantee that it's going to flip everything and suddenly make her beloved to Yaakov. Plus, this is Yaakov Avinu we're talking about. This is not some ordinary individual who's just glad to have a child. This is Yaakov, the Bechir Sheba'avois. That's how he's called. He's called the creme de la creme out of the three patriarchs. The most important thing for Yaakov is not to have a child. The most important thing, as it was for Avraham and for Yitzchak, his ancestors, the most important thing is to have a child who will be aligned to his value system. The most important thing is to have a child who's a good person, who's a wonderful human being. The most important thing is to have a child who follows what Hashem wants us to follow. Now, firstborns in the patriarch lineage did not have a good track record. Yishmael was Avraham Avinu's firstborn. That did not end well. It was such a horrific situation that Avraham Avinu had to send him away. Avraham Avinu, the kindest, most accepting, tolerant person on earth, had to, with his wife's and Hashem's encouragement, send Yishmael away because he did not belong. Avraham yotza mimenu Yishmael. He not only sent him out of his house, he severed the connection to a large extent. Yitzchak had exactly the same thing. His firstborn Esav, rogue, a murderer, a womanizer, a thief, a terrible person, who tried to sweet talk his way around Yitzchak in the hope that that would benefit him in the long run, and it didn't. Yitzchak yotza mimenu Esav. The sages tell us the same thing, that there was an excision, there was a separation. That was the end. Esav left not only physically, not only psychologically, but spiritually. He became untethered from Yitzchak. So who's to say that Reuven is guaranteed to be okay? So that's what's bothering Rashi. How is Leah so convinced? Ki atoye ovani ishi. How is she so convinced that now her husband will love her because she's given birth to this child? In order for that to happen, the child would have to be a beautiful human, a dedicated member of Bnei Yisrael, of the lineage of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, somebody who kept the values, somebody who respected, who understood Hashem's purpose, somebody who accepted what Hashem wanted from them. Completely different to the firstborns who preceded him. That's what's bothering Rashi over here. Rashi says, you've given me an explanation in the pasuk why she calls him Reuven. We get it. We understand why he's called Reuven, because of the fact that he is going to bring the solace to Leah, this love to Leah, that Hashem has noticed how distant and hated she is. Rashi wants to know, and how do we know that it's guaranteed that Reuven will do that? That's why you'll notice Rashi says, Rabbi Say No, Pirushu. Normally, in most cases, Rashi would say, Rabbi Say No, Amru. And our sages said X and Y. Why does he use the expression Rabbi Say No, Pirushu, that our sages expounded? Because that's exactly what Rashi wants us to understand over here. When I'm about to quote from the Gemara, is not an alternative explanation to what Reuven means. It is a pirush, it's an expounding of why she was convinced that this child would bring her love, and this child would be the sign that Hashem had seen her suffering. So why is he called Reuven? Kira Hashem be'ani, because Hashem has seen my suffering and now allowed a possibility that my husband will love me. Says Rashi, how do we know that her husband will love her? Because of the prophecy that Leah had of what kind of a person Reuven would be. Once we understand what a person he is, then we understand how it makes sense that he should cause Yaakov to love Leah. So what is special about Reuven? The first thing that is special about Reuven is that he appreciates his position. Esav, and this is the big distinction, you see it to an extent with Yishmael, but you see it glaringly with Esav. Esav did not appreciate his position of being firstborn. To him, it was something that carried too much responsibility. He says, if this firstborn responsibility is going to cause me to die, and Rashi pointed out in last week's parasha, what does it mean to die? Because there are so many responsibilities around the service. At that time, the Bechorim, the firstborns, were going to do the service of Hashem in the sanctuary. So there's so much responsibility around that. I don't want it. It carries too much of a penalty. It's too dangerous. I'm not going there. So what tells us that Reuven is a great person? Not that he's nice, not that he's honest, that he values to be the Bechor. What does it mean to be the Bechor? Somebody who is dedicated to serve Hashem. He values that. And that's going to give Yaakov tremendous nachas. And that's the kind of thing that's going to cause Yaakov to love Leah for having brought into his world a firstborn that is completely different to the firstborn of his father and of his grandfather. A firstborn who appreciates and values the connection to Hashem, the ability to serve Hashem. Once we see that trend, once we understand that this is what Leah used to illustrate how she now knows that Yaakov will appreciate, value, and love her, then Rashi explains, And not only does Reuven love and value the rights to be a firstborn, and that's what he absolutely cares about, which already tells you that he's a special person, but his greatness is beyond that. Because look what happens when, for whatever period of time in his life, he was so obsessed with his unique ability and opportunity to serve Hashem. Look what happens when it gets taken from him. So Esav, who didn't care about being a firstborn, felt that it was a tedium, felt that it was going to just make his life dangerous. When it gets taken from him, throws a tantrum, holds a grudge for years on end, plots the revenge against his brother who took from him what he didn't want. Compare that to Reuven. Reuven is such an amazing human. His entire life for a number of years was focused on, I'm going to be the firstborn, my children or whatever are going to serve Hashem. I'm going to serve Hashem in the most incredible way. And then it gets taken from him. You'd expect him to be upset. You'd expect him to complain. Nothing. He accepts that this is what is appropriate. He made a mess up with his father, with his father's marriage arrangements after Rachel passed away. And he was out of line, and he does teshuvah for it for the rest of his life, and he accepts with humility that if that's the case and I have to lose this position that I absolutely love, if that's what Hashem wants, I accept Hashem's choice. And not only that, but he doesn't just not hold a grudge against Yosef, he goes out of his way to help Yosef. I mean, he could have done a bit of a better job of it, he could have been a little bit more quick on the mark, but the fact is his intention was to save Yosef. That's why Rashi doesn't have to tell us about all the rogue behavior of Esav, because the main comparison is not to say Esav is so bad, therefore that highlights the goodness of Reuven. That would almost sound like it's relative. Reuven is good because Esav is bad. So Rashi skips the details about how bad Esav was, because he wants to illustrate that Reuven is good because Reuven is good. Because Reuven has the right value set. Because Reuven is dedicated to whatever Hashem wants. His intention in life is to serve Hashem. And when Hashem shifts things and says, now you're not going to serve me in the same way, he accepts it and he moves forward. And that, Leah says, is what will cause my husband to have this incredible love for me. So we've now resolved why Rashi addresses the issue, not because he believes that the pasuk is insufficient in explaining why he got his name, but rather to explain how the pasuk, or how Leah was so convinced that her son was going to be the cause of Yaakov's love. But that leads us to a very interesting observation / conversation. What is in a Torah name? It's a fascinating conversation because we've got effectively two groups in the early part of the Torah. The one group is the patriarchs, and the other group is the tribes. So you've got Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and you've got Reuven, Shimon, etc., all the way to Binyamin. Two groups. And when you look at these two groups, you'll notice various things about them that distinguish the two groups. But one of them that we're going to focus on is how they got their names. Interesting, right? How did Avraham get his name? So his father called him Avram. But that's not the name we know him by, right? We know him as Avraham. How did he get his name Avraham? Hashem gave him that name. How did Yitzchak get his name? Avraham called him Yitzchak. How did Yaakov get his name? Rashi actually says it was Hashem who gave the name Yaakov. How did the 12 Shvatim get their names? Their mothers. Interesting. In each case, the mother names the Shevet, with one exception being Binyamin. Even though Rachel, in her dying childbirth, she says Ben Oini, Yaakov gives the name Binyamin. But generally speaking, you see that the Shvatim are named by their mothers. So straight away you should wonder, you've got two groups. How come it is that the one group is named either by the fathers or by Hashem himself, and the other group are dafka named by their mothers? The other distinction that you'll find is that in every case of the Shvatim, we're told why they got their name. It's actually really interesting. Each time, why they got their name. Reuven, Hashem saw my suffering. Shimon, Hashem listened to me. Levi, now I'll accompany my husband. All the way, Yosef, Hashem should give me another son. Every single one of them, the mother explains how she got to that name. It's kind of like what you have in modern naming ceremonies. After shul, the father gets up and explains to the crowd, we chose this name for this particular reason. With Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, we don't find that the Torah says clearly they were named X because of. Why Avram was changed to Avraham. You find it in other places. Torah Shabbal Peh will explain to you various reasons what the gematria is, and Av Hamon Goyim, and Av Hamon Goyim is in the pasuk, but you don't find clearly the name so and so because of such and such. It's alluded to, whereas with the Shvatim it is spelled out clearly. So and so is called this because of that. We have to ask ourselves the question, why? What's the distinction between them? In order to understand the difference, we know that there's a saying, Ein koirin avois elo lishloisha. There are very great people in our history, including someone like Moshe Rabbeinu, incredible people who had such a profound impact on the Jewish nation right up until the modern day. But only 3 people get to be called avois, our fathers. And a father is a very unique relationship because that implies that you inherit things from your father. Right? That's the nature of it. You inherit things from your parents. So there are only 3 individuals in history, even though in Hasidus we talk about the fact that the imahois, the mothers, are also in the same way, so to speak, progenitors of our spirituality, but we're not focused here on that. We're focused on 2 different groups of male ancestry. So only Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are considered our patriarchs, our fathers, meaning to say that it is a guarantee that every single one of us, every single Jew, male or female, will by nature have within their spiritual DNA Avraham traits, Yitzchak traits, and Yaakov traits. That is a guarantee. And those traits would be things that are fairly generalized. So Avraham traits is the fact that the Jewish nation by nature are benevolent. That's why we're always looking out for the underdog and always getting involved in humanitarian efforts, because that's who we are. Avraham also had tremendous sacrifice for Hashem, so it's generically part of being Jewish that we're willing to sacrifice things for Hashem. Yitzchak is the generic yiras Hashem, that we have absolute fear of God, and you can call that Jewish guilt or whatever you want to call it, but it's there inside of ourselves. We're incapable of disconnecting from Hashem, like it or not. Yaakov is rachamim, which is more than just generosity and kindness. It's compassion, which really explains the nature of the Jewish people, that we are this compassionate people, not just a giving nation. So they affect us, every single one of us, in a fairly generic way. The 12 Shvatim, on the other hand, it's quite possible that we will have nothing of the traits of the majority of those Shvatim. In fact, typically, if you know which tribe you belong to, you can assume that you've got that specifically nuanced part of spiritual makeup that belongs to that tribe. But it's very unlikely, and it's not necessary for you to have the spiritual makeup of a different tribe. It's not your connection, it's not your path. That's why we're told there were 12 different approaches to the Beis HaMikdash, there are 12 different approaches to prayer, there are 12 different approaches to spirituality, because it's very nuanced and personalized. So the Avos are generalized spiritual makeup that we all possess, and the Shvatim represent personalized spiritual makeup that different people possess differently. Or to put it into Talmudic language, klal uprat. Klal means the general concepts, prat are the specific concepts. Like, for example, the general concept, keep Shabbos, the specifics of you may do this, you may not do that. Generally speaking, we talk about the difference between Av, Va'im, father and mother, as representing the difference between Chochmah and Bina. Chochmah is the understanding of the seed of an idea in general, whereas Bina is the intellectual development of an idea into all of its details. So if we're going to talk about two groups and two categories, it'd be valuable for us to understand that these are two different spiritual makeups. There's a spiritual makeup of the holistic concept, and there's the spiritual makeup of the specific details of a concept. Exactly as it works in the human mind. So you get an idea. When you first get the idea, you kind of know what you're talking about, but you can't really explain it to anybody else because you haven't ironed out the details. That's chokhmah. And bina is when you've really worked to express something and to understand and research it properly so that you can go through every single detail and relevant piece of information to convey it properly. And that's typically the difference between a father and a mother. A father would represent an energy that is generalized and holistic, like the seed of conception, and a mother would represent an energy that is focused and personalized, like the development of the fetus into a viable human being. Now this is the parasha about names, and our conversation is about the names as they were given to the tribes and the names as they were given to the patriarchs. So what is a name? A Jewish name, a name that comes from Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, which is the language of creation, the code of the world, the code that the universe runs on. So what is a name? A name is a portal of connection to the essence of an entity. So for example, we're told, the Midrash tells us that when Adam got up and he named all of the animals, the angels were beside themselves. They couldn't believe that such a thing was possible. That you could use words to identify the nature of the spiritual makeup of a species of beings. They couldn't so it shows insight. If you can give a name, it shows insight into the spiritual makeup of that particular being. That's why we're told that parents have a prophetic element when they name a child. However, there are two parts of what a name does. The one thing is that a name represents the bond and connection between neshama and body. The fact that there is a human being who has a name. That's the klal, the generalized connection between soul and body. And then there's another layer to the name, which is the specific nature and character of this particular individual as expressed in their particular name. By the way, in this particular sikha, there's a note where the Rebbe says that also helps us to understand the concept of reincarnation, how the neshama, the original neshama, is the klal, the generalized holistic energy. The specific human who's living currently under the name so-and-so, that represents a particular stream from that neshama that lives in this particular life. And then the next life has a different name, representing a different dimension of the neshama that is living at that particular time. Subject for another conversation, but interesting nonetheless. So when it comes to names, there are two kinds of names. There's a name that is generic. For example, the name Adam, that's a generic name for all human beings. That represents the fact that there's a living human that operates in a particular way, that has a neshama inside a body, and the neshama allows the faculties of intellect and speech which are not present in other life forms. And then there's the specific name, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, etc. When it comes to the names Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, which represent the generic connection of a Jewish soul to a human body, those names are given either by Hashem or by the Father, because the whole message over there is this is a name which is general. When it comes to the Shvatim, the name is specific because it's relating to the individual, unique kind of service of Hashem represented by Reuven, compared to the different and unique service of Hashem represented by Shimon, which is different and unique to Yisachar, which is different to Asher, etc. So because the Shvatim focus on a uniquely specific kind of flow from neshama to body, who defines and identifies those names? The mothers. Because mothers by nature are into that bina kind of detailed explanation of what a particular name and what a particular service of Hashem looks like. So if that's the case, if the mothers are supposed to be telling us about the unique service of their sons, then the pasuk over here doesn't seem to fit that. Why? Because Leah says, Ki ra'a Hashem be'anyi. Hashem saw my suffering. How does that illustrate the unique avodah, the unique service of Hashem that Reuven was going to have if she's talking about herself? Isn't the whole point of the Shvatim to identify 12 unique approaches to serve Hashem, represented by these 12 unique human beings? So why then does she say it's about me and my suffering? Therefore Rashi comes along to say, Rabbi Say No Pirushu. Our rabbis explain that even though on the surface when you read the verse it's about the mother's conversation or realization about her own circumstances, when you look beyond the surface you will notice she's actually talking about her son. And she's talking about the unique form of dedication of her son. Look at my son, what's special about him? That he loves the firstborn position and he cherishes it, and yet he has the acceptance that if it's taken from him, he won't in any way, shape or form resent that or resent the person who got it, etc. By doing this at the first of the 12 Shvatim, Rashi is priming us that as we go through the names of the other 11 Shvatim, each time that the mother says the name is related to something that happened to me, we need to know, I have to look deeper and appreciate how the name relates to the unique avodah of him, of that boy. And that's why Rashi makes such a big deal about drawing our attention to something that at first glance we wouldn't have even known needs to be discussed to help us. And now we've got homework. We've got to look through all the rest of the Shvatim and say, hang on, so what is Shmiya, listening? Because that's here we're saying Re'iyah, see something about Reuven. That will be your clue. Comes to Shimon, hear something. Okay, so we've got to know, what does Shimon indicate about hearing? What does Levi indicate about accompaniment? Accompanying Hashem on his journey, so to speak, serving in the Mishkan. Yehuda about acknowledgement and submission to Hashem, etc. That's our homework that we now have to do. It's quite interesting that the parasha Vayetze will always be in close proximity to the Yortzeit and birthday of the Mittler Rebbe, the second Rebbe of Chabad, who, as is well known, he represented the concept of Bina, meaning that the Alter Rebbe, his father, the first Chabad Rebbe, he taught very general principles of Chassidus in relatively short context. The Mittler Rebbe took that information and expanded it into thorough detail on every subject, which is the Bina, mother approach. So it's no accident, everything is Bashkacha Pratis. There's a famous teaching of the Shalah HaKadosh, that every special date on the Jewish calendar will always have a similar theme to the parasha that is around it. So it's no accident that the birthday and Yortzeit of the Mittler Rebbe, whose entire approach to teaching was the Bina, specific, detailed, expanded approach, should dafka be at the time where we read a parasha that is all about the Shvatim and the names of the Shvatim as given to them by their mothers, which also obviously emphasizes that detailed approach. I guess there's a good lesson for us. The Rebbe doesn't say this overtly in the Sikha, but there's a good lesson for us. Unfortunately, often people take ideas and they're happy to understand the idea in its most general and generic sense. And that's not really sufficient. When we come across a concept in Torah, when we learn something, it's our responsibility to get into the detail and ensure that we learn it thoroughly and that we research it properly and that we get to the point where we understand the concept fully with all of its details, because that's when you get the real clarity and the real capacity to be able to release that part of our neshama that is associated with this particular teaching and this particular way of serving Hashem, to be able to maximize the opportunity of every teaching that comes our way.